everybody. This is my curriculum development on the history of geology. Uh, I split this up with my partner that I was assigned to this section with. So I'm just covering from the 18th through the 19th centuries and then ending the early 20th century with Alfred Wegener. Oops. So I'm going to do a quick overview of like the big accomplishments for each century, and then I'll talk specifically about a few geologists who did some important work. It's not a comprehensive list, just because there are lots and lots of geologists who did, contribute something to the study of geology in these times, but there are a few of the, I would say, not more important, but some of the more important people. All right, so in the 18th century, there was early classification of different types of rocks. So more work was done with classifying rocks based on their appearance and their types of structure. There was a lot of work done in the study of rock strata, so the different layers of rocks. There were some new mountain forming theories that came out in this century. And 1775 was a big year because that's when geology was first taught as a course, as a scientific course at a university. All right, so first geologist I'll talk about is Giovanni Arduino. So he's an Italian geologist, and he was one of the first people to come up with a geologic timescale, and he did this based off of the appearance of different types of rocks and the types of fossils that occurred in those rocks. And the 4 different timescale classifications that he came up with were starting with the primitive, that was his oldest type of rock, and then secondary, tertiary, and volcanic. So obviously not a comprehensive geologic timescale, but it was the first of its kind. And this is a sketch that he came up with for different layers, and he did his studies in Italy. Right. The next geologist I'll talk about is Johann Lehmann, if I'm saying that right. So his big contribution was with classifying different types of mountains. So he came up with 3 different types of mountains and how they were formed. So one, he just said that when the world was made, there were mountains formed in that process. Another type of mountain he came up with was that it developed from sheets of sediment underwater. And then the third was volcanic. And here's a sketch from one of his drawings 4 types of mountains that were formed. All right, and then we've got Abraham Werner. He came up with a classification for different types of minerals based off of characteristics of those minerals. And he had some interesting theories. So he said that granite-type rocks, so crystalline type rocks, were formed in a worldwide ocean during the early Earth. So when the Earth was formed, he theorized that there was a large ocean, and those sort of crystalline type rocks were formed then. And then his other theory was that igneous rocks originated from the sea. And people that followed along with that theory were called Neptunists, as Neptune, the god of the sea. Right, so then the 19th century, a lot more specific things happened. So in the 19th century, there was a clear distinction in the difference in volcanic and sedimentary rocks. The idea of uniformitarianism, which is a mouthful, was a really big idea from the 19th century. And that states that the geologic processes that are going on today or back in the 19th century are the same processes that occurred in the past. So if you're seeing processes of erosion or mountain building, those same processes occurred a long time in the past as well. Bigger leaps and bounds were made using strata and fossils for dating and categorizing different types of rocks. And chemistry started to be used in a larger role to categorize and describe rocks as well. So first, let's talk about James Hutton. And he really was kind of at the end of the 18th century, going into the 19th, but he's considered the father of modern geology. He studied unconformities and came up with the theory that if there's an igneous intrusion cutting across some other type of rock, that igneous intrusion must be younger. So older rocks exist, and then an igneous intrusion comes across and can kind of melt through the other rocks. And he was a Plutonist, and so those were the people that were of the mindset that igneous rocks came from molten material. And then he was really the father of the uniformity theory, which I talked about on the last slide. So there was a big dispute between the Neptunists and the Plutonists. And so it's kind of a little bit fuzzy, hard to see, but this is a cartoon where the Neptunists are up here in the sea, kind of riding a sea creature, and the Plutonists are down here. And the Plutonists were the ones who thought that igneous rocks came from molten material, so magma. The Neptunists thought that they came from the sea. And they argued until about 1820, when the Plutonist theory was generally accepted. Another important figure was William Smith. He studied fossils and how they appeared in strata. And he did a lot of work in England. So this is one of his maps of different strata layers in England. And his study of strata was really important in the creation of our modern geologic timescale. So that's where you have like the Jurassic period, the Cretaceous period, all the different geologic timescale periods. He mostly studied strata from the Jurassic period, but his work was really important in that classification. So in the 20th century, I'm not going to go into much detail besides talk a little bit about Alfred Wegener, because this was a big turning point in geology, the study of geology. So Alfred Wegener noticed that fossil records and the shapes of coastlines of different continents matched up. So specifically, like the east coast of South America and the west coast of Africa, it looks like their shapes line up. And when he studied the fossil records, he noticed that similar fossils existed on both continents. And so in 1912, he proposed the continental drift theory, that all the continents were once the supercontinent Pangaea, and that the continents slowly drifted away from each other to, create our world as we know it. His theory was actually didn't go over very well. It was initially just ridiculed until enough evidence came out to support his theory. And that's where I'm going to stop my discussion of the history of geology. Thanks a lot.